Warning, the following program contains critical thinking, honest opinions, viewpoints on culture that may seem conservative, and a positive view on absolute detestable things such as marriage and children. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello, fellow humans, and welcome back to Subtle Rampage podcast, where we discuss things of political nature, cultural nature, literary nature, whatever I feel like talking about, really. And today I have a very serious question for you, okay? Has shame made you a better person? If it has, was it personal shame or public shame? Like, was it brought on internally through your own understanding of right and wrong, or through your relationship with God, or was it brought on externally by others, probably in a public setting like school or church, or a public forum like the internet? And the reason that I ask that is because I think there's a pretty substantial difference between the two. And today I want to briefly walk y'all through some of my thoughts on the concept and what I think the role of shame is in our lives. So, what is shame exactly? Let's start off with the dictionary definitions here, okay? According to the New Webster's Dictionary, the 1990 edition is the one I grabbed off my shelf for reference. Shame is a painful emotion aroused by the recognition that one has failed to act, behave, or think in accordance with the standards which one accepts as good. Now, obviously, that is in reference to a personal, like internal invoking of shame, whereas guilt, on the other hand, is defined as a feeling of culpability. Which is pretty much just blame or responsibility for some sort of wrongdoing. So, guilt and shame, for the record, aren't truly interchangeable terms if we get down to the definitions. Shame typically stems from the exposure of guilt. This can be external exposure to other people in a public setting, in a private relationship, whatever it is, or it can be internal exposure to your own conscience or acknowledgement that your guilt is always exposed to the eyes of God or whatever happens internally to make you feel that shame. Now, to take that concept a step further, when I was looking a few things up for this episode, I came across the Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary definition of shame, which says a negative emotion caused by an awareness of wrongdoing, hurt ego, or guilt. In the Bible, the feeling of shame is normally caused by public exposure of one's guilt. Shame may also be caused by a hurt reputation or embarrassment, whether or not this feeling is due to sin. And I think that's one of the more interesting components of shame is that it doesn't even necessarily have to stem from guilt. Like, if somebody is shaming you for something, you might not have even done that thing, or you might not even be the way that they are portraying you in their public shaming of you, but you can still feel the shame of something that you haven't even done wrong. But I guess one of the big things that you kind of have to ask when it comes to the actual feeling of shame is it a negative thing? Is shame negative? And I think just like fear or unhappiness or pain, I think there can be a positive connotation to shame. Just like without fear, we would not know when to protect ourselves. And without pain, we wouldn't know, when something was wrong physically or emotionally. And without unhappiness, we would have no gauge for what happiness felt like. So I think that with shame, we wouldn't always know what appropriate behavior was without it. We wouldn't know certain aspects of good character without it. And for that matter, we wouldn't know certain aspects of bad character without it. When it comes to analyzing whether or not shame is like a bad thing or a good thing or whatever, there's this quote that I wrote down in my journals. Like, I think a year and a half ago. I have no idea where I got it. Sometimes I'm really good about keeping track of these things, and sometimes I am not. But there's this one quote that goes something along the lines of guilt is just as powerful as shame, but the influence is positive, whereas with shame, the influence is destructive. Shame erodes courage and fuels disengagement, something like that. And I I've always found that quote interesting, that differential between guilt and shame, how people, define the 2. But anyways, I delved in a bit to one of Jordan Peterson's, videos on the subject. I mean, I don't know if it was directly on the subject, it was just him talking about stuff in general, and there is this clip of him discussing shame as a negative emotion, and he pretty much just thinks that the idea of shame being a destructive emotion is kind of ridiculous, and that the observation of that is a very modern concept when it comes to like research studies and psychology and stuff. Shame being destructive is a very new idea, and he pretty much goes like psychopathy and shamelessness are the same thing. No emotion is always destructive, no emotion is always negative. Any emotion can be destructive when taken to an extreme. And what I would contemplate with that is, um, would publicly shaming someone automatically be taking that emotion to the extreme? Like, does that automatically do so? Um, then he also talks about how joy can be destructive. He pretty much gives mania as an example, like people going through a manic episode are experiencing joy to such an extreme that that quote unquote positive emotion becomes a destructive emotion. Um, and I don't know what I think about that. I feel like mania is not something that people like every single person deals with, but I guess that is an example of a positive emotion being destructive. I don't know. Take from that what you will, I guess. But he goes on to say something along the lines of like, if you do something stupid, okay, and it's destructive to you or it's destructive to those around you, and you should feel shame, okay? And if you are not learning from it, if you're not paying attention to it, and you're not understanding why you're feeling the shame that you do, then people should just stay away from you because you're being shameless. And I thought that was interesting, because it reminded me of a Bible verse in Second Thessalonians that I'll get to a little bit later, and I'll discuss that in a bit. But yeah, I'm obviously very well spoken today. Anyways, to kind of juxtapose Jordan Peterson's views with Freud's depiction of shame, I would say it kinda goes in this linear fashion, okay, because you have anxiety, which turns into guilt or superego, anxiety, and then you have shame, which results in repression. Of course, in light of Freud's theories, um, I would say that he would believe shame to be a destructive emotion because it ultimately leads to this act of repression, which in many of his teachings is something to be broken down in order to explore the reasoning behind people's behavior and their belief systems and why they act and say the things that they do. And so, I don't know. In Freud's view, from what I can gather, shame is pretty much this fear of external danger. It's this fear of disapproval from others, and that fear would kind of be an equivalent of anxiety. And you could probably spend an insane amount of time on deconstructing Freud's teachings on the subject, but people certainly have, of course, and I only bring up his viewpoints just because he has such a huge influence on psychology and on what's taught in schools. And not necessarily because I like anything he says. I honestly despise Freud's teachings, his lectures, and his theories. He always found some way to incorporate some gross sexual aspect into practically everything he talked about. Um, so I'm not much of a fan, to say the least. But anyways, we'll move on. Okay, let's talk about publicly shaming people as a method of control. Now, throughout history, okay, as far as publicly shaming people goes, You have villages would cast people out. They'd be like, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow, dishonor. Oh, wait, that's Disney. Never mind. Anyways, but people would get hanged. Okay. They would hang people because it was humiliating. Okay. And it was an example. I think that's a form of publicly shaming. You had the stockades where people would sit there with their head and their hands and like, in between the wood with the little holes in it. You know what I'm talking about. Anyways, there was that was publicly shaming people. That was public humiliation. You have examples in literature like the Scarlet Letter. People were murdered in ways that were humiliating all the time because they did something that was shameful to the public eye. And granted, it was a way and is a way to control the behavior of a person or a group of people. Don't get me wrong. Um, it definitely worked in certain instances, but whether or not that's a good method to use, questionable. Obviously, there are things like, you know, um, corporal punishment. Okay, that I think falls under this category, or even just, in school or whatever, like a teacher calling out a student in front of everybody for something that they are not supposed to be doing, or even like if somebody is talking in class, a teacher calling them out and going out of their way to shame that person in public, to shame that child. I think that falls under this category as well. But today, we publicly shame people out of groups, out of school, out of their jobs, their livelihoods. And I would say that with how often this happens, especially with social media, it's quite rare that losing things like that, like your job, okay, is an appropriate consequence for whatever the person did or said. Um, you can argue that there's always going to be consequences for your actions and you should be aware of what's acceptable to the public and you should handle yourself accordingly, and it's like, yeah, but at the same time, um not everything that people are publicly shamed for is worthy of being publicly shamed for. There's this mob mentality in this age of social media where somebody could do the most unoffensive thing, say the most unoffensive thing that nobody in real life would ever think twice about, but because they're behind a computer screen or a phone screen or whatever, and they're just going about their business like, typing comments and whatever, all of a sudden it is offensive.
That is offensive. Next question.
And, whoever posted it, they are the problem and they need to be dealt with and they need to be shamed for the thing that they did that was wrong. How dare they? I personally, I don't understand that type of interaction online. I grew up hearing constantly the whole idea of, your public perception online, colleges are going to look at what you post and what you say. Jobs are going to look at what you post and what you say. Like you need to have a good, well-mannered, appropriate presentation of who you are on the internet. And I get that things have definitely changed in recent years with things like TikTok and all that, but at the same time, there is a sense of shamelessness. Oh, that just connected in my head. Okay, there's another reason. There's another way that shame can be a positive thing. Okay, you should feel shame for some of the things that are posted on TikTok. That's all I'm saying. Like there are things that people post with absolutely no shame whatsoever, and I'm like, "Oh my god, why? Stop."
Stop it. Get some help.
I just think it's it's so easy when people are on the internet to, as soon as one person says something, one person takes offense to something, somebody else will see it and be like, "Oh, you know what? You're so right." And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, there's this one person that posted something or said something or did something, and they're being ganged up on by like a bajillion different people who for some reason are taking offense to whatever they did or said or whatever. And it's just kind of insane. It really is. It's just, it's a bit crazy. It's a bit unstable, but some people are unstable. So, what are you going to do? But one of the things that prompted me to think so much about this topic is the last several years with all of the COVID stuff and people's opinions on how other people should have been handling COVID and handling the mandates and the restrictions, etc. Um, I think back to the time where my dad and I went to visit some family out of state, and for those of you who don't know what the Mars Cheese Castle is, you have to go to the Mars Cheese Castle in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Buy yourself some Wisconsin string cheese, some Wisconsin beer, okay, and, just have a good time because I that's all I'm gonna say. Maybe buy yourself a cheese hat. It's good stuff. But so if you haven't gone, go. But anyways, we were at the Mars Cheese Castle of all places with a family member who does not think similarly to me or my family whatsoever. And that's fine. That's all great and dandy. But it just makes me think back to the time that we were there with him, and I got yelled at in the Mars Cheese Castle very, very loudly. It was over the COVID stuff, and it was a completely unnecessary conversation. And I won't get into the specifics because it doesn't really matter that much. But um, what makes me think of it is just this little part of the conversation that happened because, um, it was something about, like, the topic of publicly shaming people came up, and he was yelling at me, and he was like, "You know what?" He's like, "People just need to be publicly shamed, and they need to just listen to what we're telling them," and I was like, "You think people need to be publicly shamed into wearing masks and you think people need to be publicly shamed into taking the vaccine?" And he was like all gung ho, like, yes, they do. And I was like, are we supposed to? I'm like, you're Catholic, right? Or should we be publicly shaming people into being Catholic? Like, I don't understand this whole idea. I don't get it. Do you not see the malice that can be behind the whole concept of public shaming? And he, and then he told me he was atheist. And I could not, like, I was like, "Oh, that explains so much." Apologies to any atheists out there, but, for the record, for the context, it explained a lot. Um, and I was like, "Okay." Well, I was like, w so I was like, "Because I don't want to wear a mask and because I will not be getting vaccinated, you think that I should be publicly shamed?" And he was like, "Well, not you." He was like, "I'm talking about these people." And I was like, "What do you mean not me?" And I had to, like, kind of, like, use a calm tone, and I was like, "Hey," I was like, "Listen to me real quick." I was like, "I've seen the things that you post on social media. I know that we don't agree on things, but, it is a very much a shaming attitude. It is very much calling people that think like me murderers, like that type of approach." And I was like, "You do realize that when you're saying these people that think like this, you are talking about me." And he was like, "No, I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about you." He's just like, he's like, "You're a completely different person." And I'm like, "No, I'm like, I'm part of the group that you think should be publicly shamed into doing what you believe is best." And it was such a, like, mind-boggling conversation. But I think that's what kind of got me thinking on this for the last year or so, is just that whole conversation and the whole idea of, like, people should be publicly shamed. And I'm like, should they? I'm like, I don't know if I can really think of any situation where publicly shaming people is really the answer. But that's just me. I don't know, maybe you can. I mean, is it okay to publicly shame people just because that no longer typically includes physical violence? Like, is it okay? And to me, the obvious answer is no. And I'd love to hear any expansions on the argument that it is an acceptable approach, but I think that there's something to be said for respect and acknowledgement of other people's dignity. If you would not respond well to public humiliation, to the extent that you mean to bring it on someone else, maybe think on that for a hot minute, maybe forever, you know? Don't do it. I think one of the unfortunate consequences of publicly shaming a person is that they're far more likely to hold on to that shame way longer than they should, way longer than they were meant to, way longer than is best for them. And they're probably way less likely to let go of it and move on to better things and to change that behavior in the first place. And when I'm talking about publicly shaming people, okay, I'm not talking about like general public discourse. Okay, there's going to be people that disagree with other people and bring up why they disagree or why they don't like somebody or why this person is wrong about this specific subject. And, obviously in today's age of, online content and stuff, people react to things that other people do and they say, hey, this is stupid. Like, what is wrong with you? Why do you think this way? Why did you say it this way? And I think that that is just kind of normal. Like, I mean, you might disagree, but I think that is kind of just normal for today's climate. I don't really take issue with, just general discourse on those issues, but I do take issue with malintent. Like, if you are setting out to if you're reacting to somebody's statement about something, or you're reacting to somebody's appearance, or you're reacting to a person with ill will towards them just because, you don't like them or you don't like what they said or whatever it is, and you think that they need to be shamed and they like whatever they did was so wrong when really it's just that you disagree with them. I think that's where the line kind of needs to be drawn. Like, you should not be going after somebody with malice in your heart. But that's just what I think. And, who am I? And not that I'm in any particular way an advocate for this guy's belief system, but John Ronson, he's a journalist, not author, I guess, if you want to consider him that. He did write a whole book on public shaming and its history and its negative effects and whatever. And there's this quote from him that I do want to read, and it says, social media in the modern age has hardened us and turned us into hanging judges. It's made us forget that we are all a mix of talents and flaws and sins. We're creating a hard, frightening world where somebody can get defined by their stupidity as opposed to their stupidity being put into a sort of wider human context. And I think he's right. I think when a person or group is publicly shamed for something, and perhaps that something is a sin or a wrong, I think that taking that approach shuts down others who might be struggling with that same issue or may have done that same thing in the past. It can almost, in some ways, close the door for redemption. Of course, not like in a personal relationship with the Lord, but it can probably lead a person to feel as though that door is closed. And especially as Christians, okay, if you are a Christian, you should not want to have that effect on somebody ever. You don't ever want them to feel like there is not a way for them to change. You don't want them to feel like there is not the opportunity for redemption just because they watched you shame somebody else so badly for the same thing that they're struggling with. Maybe that doesn't make sense. It makes sense in my head. It makes sense as I'm saying it. Hopefully that thought came out coherent. I don't know. I guess I'll find out. But now that we know what the worldly context for shame is, let's talk about what the Bible says. So, Paul, okay, my guy Paul, has a bit of a track record when it comes to this whole shaming thing. If you look up, like, how many times is, shame mentioned in the Bible, Paul has a lot of them, just because it's the word that's used in the English translation. But let's consider the context, okay? He's a believer. most often talking to other believers. So there's some sort of equal footing there for the most part. And I think the key thing here is he's not necessarily taking it upon himself to bring shame on others. He's more so pleading with these other people, these other believers, to search within themselves and to acknowledge and contemplate their own shame. He's pretty much begging these churches and the people in these churches to do what Jordan Peterson was talking about. He's saying don't be shameless. He's saying, you need to acknowledge shame. You need to allow yourself to feel shame about the things that you should feel shame about. Um, he's not calling on, all these big groups of people. He's not calling upon all these non-believers to gang up on the church that he's writing to. Um, like he's pleading with the church themselves to grow in their relationship with God to the point where they do feel shame for the things that they should. Hopefully you're seeing the difference that I'm pointing out, but yeah. So I've got my handy dandy Bible here, my La Biblia, I think is Spanish for it. I don't know. Anyways, I'll just kind of go over a few of the mentions of shame in Paul's writings and just kind of give my little commentary on them. I'm not a pastor. I didn't go to seminary. So, if you see holes in my logic or commentary, point them out, I guess, and I will revise my thought process accordingly. But yeah. Anyways, 1 Corinthians 15:34 says, "Awake to righteousness and do not sin, for some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." And so in this instance, I think it's important to clarify that he's not saying, "Hey, I'm going to shame you right here, right now, because you're not awake to righteousness, okay? And and you're sinning. And there's people out there who don't know God, and you do, and you should be ashamed of the way they're acting." He's more so saying, "Hey, like you need to like not sin." Because you know God, you have this relationship with God, you have this knowing of what's right and what's wrong because you are in that relationship and you have this faith, whereas other people don't have that. Quit acting like, you know, the people who don't know God because you're being shameless. That's my interpretation of it. Maybe you interpret it differently. But yeah. Then we have Romans 6:21, which says, "What fruit did you have then in the things of which you are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death." Now, here, if you ask me, because I'm the authority on this, obviously. Paul seems to be coming from this place of concern, okay, for the outcomes of the behavior he's reprimanding. He's not condemning the people he's speaking to a specific fate, okay? He's not saying that they will die because of the things that they're doing. He's alerting them of the likely outcome of their actions. It's a call to consider the impact of certain decisions. It's a call to acknowledge that there are things that you should feel shame for. It's a call to use discretion as to what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. It doesn't seem like he's necessarily setting out to bring some sort of external shame on people. He's begging them to have awareness, to be aware and contend with their personal, their internal shame. Okay, now we get to the verse that I was talking about when I was discussing Jordan Peterson's whole situation about staying away from people who are shameless. Because now we get to 2 Thessalonians 3:14, which says, "And if anyone does not obey our word in this epistle, note that person and do not keep company with him, that he may be ashamed." Now, there's a few different translations of this. Um, Let me grab my notes here real quick.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Got 'em. Anyways, what I just read to y'all was out of the King James Version. And then this is a version of which is unspecified because I did not take note of it in my notes. But I'm sure with a simple Google search of the same language, you can find the version that it is. It's probably NIV or something. But this version of it says, "Take special note of anyone who does not obey our instructions in this letter. Do not associate with them in order that they may feel ashamed." Now, I have a few thoughts on this. I I understand partially like, I get it. Like, growing up in the church or whatever, you hear, don't hang out with just friends who are going to lead you astray. Like, don't do it because you will be led astray. Um However, I question if sentiments like this are what lead to ousting people from the church or shunning people in certain communities, like in the Amish or the Mennonites or whatever, for things that aren't really the end of the world. Things that could be approached in a different way. Just because people so often take one verse like this and run with it despite its context. So I don't know. But when we're considering what else the Bible says, when I read that verse, I think of different contexts that people have probably used it in throughout the years, the decades, the centuries, and I think of the sermon that my pastor friend, Pastor Kelly out in East Tennessee, hello, I'm sure he's listening, and we'll have plenty of things to say if I got anything wrong theologically. But anyways, while perhaps not the sole focus of the sermon that he sent me, he did bring up the call to be slow to speak and slow to anger. And I liked that he expanded upon that, pretty much saying being slow to speak means being slow to judge. It means being slow to denounce things and slow to embrace things. It means taking everything into consideration and really using the discretion and the judgment and the discernment that is at your hands when you have a relationship with the Holy Spirit. And just to clarify, the reason that I think of that part of the sermon when I'm thinking of this verse in particular is just because I feel like we're so quick to grab a verse on its own or a series of verses on their own and take them out of context because you might have been listening to me talk just now and and you've read Second Thessalonians and you're like, but Adelia, there's nothing small or anything like that in Second Thessalonians. It all is important things. They're all things that believers should be doing. And you're right. I don't disagree. I don't think anything in Second Thessalonians, okay, that's outlined is really anything small or trivial. Um, but I was more so approaching it in the aspect of like when if somebody were to take that verse on its own out of context, what would they take away from that verse? Because so often we do take verses out of context. So I'm like, if you have it in its context, I think it's fine. I think if somebody in the church takes it out of context, I think it can result in a lot of problems. Taking a verse like that one from Second Thessalonians out of context can result in a lot of the church hurt, okay, scenarios that we see a lot of in the Western church. And I'm sure that happened a lot back then in Bible times too. But I'm just speaking from what I know, and what I do know is that a lot of Christians and a lot of people who grew up in the church who do not call themselves Christians have experienced some sort of, casting out from their church community or, public shaming from their church community over something that was not detrimental to their faith. And so I think that part of that probably stems from taking certain verses out of context and going, oh, well, this person's a terrible person because blah, 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 blah. And yeah, so I don't know. That's just the connections that my brain made. Maybe it makes no sense to you. Maybe I'm going off on a bunch of random rabbit trails and you're just confused at this point, but whatever. The last verse that I gathered in preparation for this episode that I collected because Bible verses are like, expensive antiques. Anyways, is First Corinthians 1:27, which says, But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, which just kind of exemplifies this balance of things. And so I think this, it kind of rounds out our little venture here into what the Bible says about shame. Just a bit. There's probably countless other verses and passages that you can pull if you want to dive in deeper. But for the purposes of this episode, okay, I think we can pretty much conclude that there are acknowledgments of shame in the Bible that are both positive and negative. There's nuance, okay? And, I think that those who have put really any thought to the subject of maturity and development, okay, understand that to a certain extent you gain maturity by simply allowing yourself to appreciate nuance in the things around you, in personal relationships, in business relationships, in conversations, in photos, songs, the tweet that the person you don't like posted the other day. Like, just seeing the nuance in all the things around you is part of growing as a person. And I think as soon as you're able to accept that nuance of specific ideas and behaviors, I think you're more likely to be able to handle conversations and situations more maturely and respectfully, because ultimately you're going to be able to see people more as individual human beings instead of whatever label has been bestowed upon them by yourself or others. As far as where publicly shaming a person might work, I guess, if you're going to take that approach, I think it would have to be where the intent is not to ostracize a person, but to lovingly reprimand them. And not only does that have to be the intent, I think that has to be the outcome. The outcome has to be a resolution for both parties. It cannot be the ostracization of one person. I also think that both parties would have to be on somewhat equal footing, okay? Like I said earlier with Paul talking to other believers, um, it shouldn't be like an adult publicly shaming a child, okay? Or a professor publicly shaming a student, or a boss publicly shaming an employee. Like, that's just kind of icky to me. I personally don't believe the method of public shaming is exactly biblical. Even if you look at Paul and you go, well, Paul was doing it. I don't think he was, but even if he was, he is a man. He is a human. And you can look at another human all day long and say, well, they do that. Doesn't mean you should do that. And you can be like, well, it's in the Bible. Okay. There's a lot of things in the Bible. Noah, David, and the list goes on. There's a lot of things in the Bible. It doesn't mean you should be doing everything that's in the Bible. Some things are cautionary tales, okay? Anyways, um, I don't think publicly shaming people is biblical, nor is it practical. But if you are the type of person who believes that this works, I don't think you should be going into it unless you have the right intent, with the only acceptable result in your mind being reconciliation of some sort. Even then, be prepared to lose friends or lose whoever you're confronting. Just be prepared to lose social connections in your life, because, it's kind of shady to publicly shame someone. If you can somehow get a crap ton of people to back you online, then maybe you won't lose everybody in your life, because, you'll have this whole mob behind you. But I don't recommend it. I think that publicly shaming people is kind of malicious in nature. And, even though there are important conversations and confrontations that you have to have throughout your lifetime, that may result in you or another person feeling shame, you should not be personally setting out to cause a person that feeling. If you are the type of person who would set out to purposefully cause somebody to feel shame like, of your own volition, to you, I would say the infamous line of "Have you no shame?" Because come on, it's kind of terrible. It's kind of crappy if you ask me. Of course, there are certain behaviors in which you can't really help but shame someone. Like if somebody sexually abuses a child, okay, that's, you know, pretty shameful behavior and people are going to lash out against stuff like that, and rightfully so. However, I think more often than not, with the things that people really should be ashamed of, like that, you are not going to be able to just demand that they feel ashamed and then immediately get that response. I don't think it depends on you or even a whole group of people telling them that they should be feeling a certain way about what they did. Shame is that internal happening, it's an internal revelation that often crops up, okay, within a person's own conscience, within their own relationship with God. It's in here and in here, okay? It's not out here with everybody else. But I'll go ahead and do a quick callback, okay? At the beginning of this episode, I asked the question of whether shame has made you a better person, and if that shame was brought on internally through your own understanding of right and wrong, or through your relationship with God, or if that shame was brought on externally by others in a public setting. My own answer to this question, okay, contains a bit of that nuance that I mentioned earlier, as I'm sure yours does as well. I think that internal shame that I've personally experienced throughout my life, either for decisions I've made or things that I've blurted out or habits that I kept or whatever, I think that having that internal conflict and overcoming much of it has made me a better person. Better. A better. A better on it. Apologies. Apparently, I am channeling a less hardcore version of Brockhampton right now. And moving on to what I was actually trying to say, I think that that internal shame has made me a better person. However, I've also experienced instances of being publicly shamed. And I do not believe that I've ever gotten a positive effect from that. The only personal growth that I believe I've gotten out of being publicly shamed has been probably just learning how to handle myself appropriately in the face of public dissonance, which yes, that is a good thing to learn, that is a good thing to be able to do. However, I don't much care for the experience of learning it. That's all I'm going to say. But I'll leave you with this as a conclusion, okay? When we publicly shame others, I think we put ourselves in a position of power, a position of judgment that we don't really have a right to in most circumstances, one that we are not entitled to. Every situation is going to be different, obviously, but I would be very wary, very wary of I'm getting a little loopy. I don't know what time it is, but I would be wary of putting yourself in the position to convict other people. Okay, I think that that's not necessarily your job. That's the job of the Holy Spirit. I would also be wary of judging others because gone about in a certain way, I think you're trampling a little bit into God's territory. There's righteous judgment, there is righteous anger, and there is something to be said for bringing up certain issues with brothers and sisters in Christ. But just in general, maybe try to use a bit of that discretion and discernment that you have in relationship with the Holy Spirit when you're dealing with anything revolving around the feeling of shame. Anyways, that is all I have to say for this episode. I hope you enjoyed my ramblings for the week. And if you did and you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Keep doing that. I like having listeners. If you have anything to add to the conversation about shame, if you thought anything was particularly interesting, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, you know, leave a comment, reach out to me. If you know me personally, I'd love to hear what you think about this. Anyways, you have a great week and I will be back next week or whenever I feel like it. Bye-bye.